Hey besties, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you guys some of my favorite books that have really changed my life and inspired me to become a writer. I have so many favorite books that have changed my life in so many different ways, but this month is National Novel Writing Month, and so I wanted to specifically share some books that I really admire, not only as a reader but also as a writer. It's currently halfway through November when I'm filming this, and if you're like me and you're competing in NaNoWriMo this month, you might be starting to feel a little bit burnt out. You might find it helpful to think about some books that really inspire you. I would love to hear what those books are, so feel free to comment them down below. And even if you're not a writer, I would love to just hear what books have had an impact on your life. And I mean, if you want to take these books that I talk about as some recommendations to find some inspiration, you can totally do that, because obviously these books have inspired me, so maybe they'll inspire you as well. If you know anything about me, you would know that I am obsessed with The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I've talked about it before and I will talk about it again. This is essentially a campus murder mystery. It follows a group of students, a group of friends, basically follows their life at university. They all study Greek classics, and basically we just see them do a whole bunch of stupid shit and then one of them ends up dying. That's not even a spoiler. Literally the first sentence in the prologue is, "The snow in the mountains was melting and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation." So this was the first adult book that I ever read, probably about 6 years ago now, and when I say I felt like a different person after finishing this book, I became immediately obsessed with this, and I ended up studying this in high school for my final year of English and also the scholarship English class that I took, and I've also studied this at university. I could go into heavy detail about The Secret History, but I won't, because there is so much to unpack about this and I genuinely could just talk about this book forever. But ultimately I think this is just such a genius story. Say what you will about Donna Tartt, I don't think she's the best person really out there, but this book is just such genius. The way that the plot is told, the way that the story is revealed, the characters. Analyzing these characters is one of my favorite hobbies. They are all so interesting, maybe not on the surface. A lot of people say that they very much seem very shallow and stereotypical, but I really do think that there's a lot more to them than what you might initially think, and that's kind of basically what the whole story is kind of like that. It might seem very simple, but the more you dig into this, the more you find, and I absolutely love that. I absolutely love books where you discover something new every single time that you read them, and I think the fact that I've just been able to analyze this so much as a reader, this book has just had to have influenced my writing in some way, because it really has just influenced my whole life from the point that I read it. The next book I want to talk about, I feel like I don't talk about enough, maybe ever. I don't know if I've ever talked about this book before, which is crazy to me because every single day I wake up and I think about Jane Eyre. Not a day has gone by since I've read this that I have not woken up and thought about Jane. I really did not expect to fall in love with this book when I read it. I feel like a lot of the very classic book recs, I feel like they're all kind of, at least the ones that I've read, which to be fair isn't many, but I feel like they're all kind of just average. I usually read them, I usually feel that they're outdated, and I just really don't seem to get the appeal of them. But Jane Eyre, I read this for a paper that I was studying at university, and maybe that helped, the fact that I was studying this, but I was so enthralled in reading the story. I cried so many times, which I was not expecting at all. Any book that moves me to tears has to be a good book, but I absolutely love the literature movement that this book technically is a part of, the Romantic movement. Jane Eyre was the text that we studied for the Romantic period, and I mean, it's called the Romantic period. You'd probably expect it to be all focused on romance, and it kind of is, but what I love about the Romantic period is how it uses nature. I love how it's by reflecting outwards, you reflect inwards, and I definitely think that this really just brought the character of Jane to life, and obviously it did a really great job because Jane is just a character that haunts me. I love how it focuses on simply Jane, like just one character. Not only that, but female character. Not only that, it follows her life from when she's a very small child to when she is an adult, and I love how independent the story is. At least from what I read of classics, I just feel like there aren't very many independent classics like this, and I really just loved studying this. I feel like I learned so much, and I feel like there's still so much I could learn from this book. I would love to study the Romantic period and how the influence of nature kind of brings a genderless identity to the work from that period, because I really found that reading Jane Eyre, especially considering that back then gender roles were very set and prevalent in society. I feel like Jane Eyre she simply existed, and I know obviously she is a she, but there was something just a little bit distanced from gender about Jane, and I really loved that, and I'd love to look into that more. Also just the Romantic period in general, but Jane will always be special. I really can't believe that I haven't actually talked about this book so much. I love this book with my whole being. The next book I want to talk about, I don't own a physical copy of. I feel like this is probably the most obscure book that I'm going to talk about. It is a New Zealand piece of fiction called Queen of Beauty by Paula Morris, and I read this at the start of this year for my first semester doing my master's in creative writing, and this really surprised me. I haven't read a lot of New Zealand fiction, which is probably shocking seeing as I live in New Zealand, but a lot of New Zealand literature just hasn't really appealed to me, but I'm so glad that I had to pick this up. Simply, this story is about Virginia, who is in her early 20s, and she's over in America studying, but she's currently like interning, working for a famous author, helping her come up with story ideas, you know, doing research and stuff like that. And we basically follow her as she goes home for a family wedding over Christmas. But this book is so layered that it is so much more than that. This book is all about stories and telling stories. So throughout the book, there's kind of this one underlying story which we see being retold over and over and over again by different people and through different lenses, which is just so fascinating. And I think this book did a really great job of representing the oral act of storytelling, which is a very important part of cultural storytelling, which is relevant in a lot of cultures, but specifically Māori culture. I think the story just did a really great way of visualizing the way that stories are passed on from generation to generation, and the way that stories are manipulated depending on who is telling the story. This book was just so eye-opening as well. It really made me realize how much of an influence Māori culture has had on my writing, because I wasn't really brought up in Māori culture, but growing up in New Zealand, this made me realize how much Māori culture has actually influenced my ideas on time and storytelling and voice, which are obviously all very important when it comes to telling stories. So that was really interesting, and this really made me want to look into my culture more, I guess, and I'm really glad that I got to read that and like find that out. I definitely don't think that this is like the most amazing book. I feel like not everyone would really enjoy this, but if you're interested in picking up some New Zealand literature, this is really fascinating and I would recommend it. Speaking of Masters in Creative Writing, the next book I'm going to mention is Bunny by Mona Awad, which is about a woman named Samantha who is currently studying for her master's in creative writing, and we see her taking this creative writing program with this group of other girls who are obviously all very close, very good friends, except they're all a little bit weird. Basically, this group of girls, they all call themselves Bunny and they act kind of like a mini cult, and we see what happens when these girls invite Samantha into their group. So this book is technically a horror, kind of like a thriller, and I don't want to say too much about the plot because there isn't really much that you can say about the plot. This is a very metaphorical story. I have a copy, but I have lent it to a friend, but what it says on like the blurb, it says that this is a story all about like belonging and loneliness, friendship, desire, and the imagination, which all comes under being a creator, being an artist. This book is so unhinged, which I absolutely love. I think that's what I love the most about it, is how absolutely unhinged it is. It is like you just read this and it is so confusing, but like in the best way possible. I was talking about Bunny with a friend recently, and we were saying how there are some books that are written super pretentiously and are like really about nothing, and Bunny is that type of book, but it is done so well. And there are definitely books that do that aren't done well, but Bunny is not one of those. Bunny is so great, and this book just really showed me a completely different way of writing and storytelling with how absolutely unhinged this was. Oh my god, I would love to write something as unhinged as this. This is so good. highly recommend this. Next, I don't really have a specific book so much as just an author who I really want to mention. I could not mention her, and that is Savannah Brown, who is an author but also a poet, and I only own her 2 novels. I don't own her poetry collections, which I would say are probably where I get most of my inspiration from. But if you don't know who Savannah Brown is, she is obviously a writer, but she was also a YouTuber, and Savannah Brown was the only YouTuber that I watched growing up in my teen years. She's not really on YouTube anymore, she's probably too busy being a full-time writer, but Savannah Brown constantly inspires me to experiment with my language. I read her stuff and it makes me want to go pick up a dictionary and read it. Like, just read the dictionary, because I want to master the English language as well as she has. I just really admire the way that she makes me think about the words that I use and the importance of the words that we use. I feel like that's something that you can easily forget as a writer, but she constantly reminds me of the fact that the language that we use is so important, the power of language, and I couldn't not mention her in this video. I think her work is incredible. Like, I mean, obviously I said her poetry is probably what is most inspiring, but you see her use of language obviously in her novels as well. She's just great, truly. Highly recommend, you know, following her, buying her stuff. I just think she has such a unique and refreshing way of writing. Someone that you probably have heard of is Colleen Hoover, and the next book I wanted to mention was Verity. I feel like Colleen Hoover is really known for her romances, but this is a mystery thriller romance, and this book follows a writer called Lowen who basically gets this really great job offer to become a ghostwriter for this super famous author who has unfortunately been in an accident and she can't carry on. She's like halfway through writing a series. She's already sold the rights for the next few books. So this famous author, whose name is Verity, her husband has been tasked with finding someone to carry on writing the series for Verity. Lowen is the chosen writer, and things basically just get interesting when Lowen accepts the job. You really don't need to know much about the plot going into this book. I think the less you know, the better reading experience you will have. But as someone who has never really been, you know, scared by books before, this is probably the closest I have ever got to being scared. Reading this book, I was so tense. I was reading this very late at night, like around midnight, and I finished this and I put the book down. I didn't want to leave the bedroom to go to the bathroom because I didn't want to step out into the dark hallway, because I wasn't scared, but I was on edge. And simply it's because Colleen Hoover is such a visual writer. Her imagery is amazing. I didn't even feel like I was reading this when I was reading it. It felt like I was watching a movie. I could so perfectly visualize everything about this book, which might not be amazing to anyone else, but I honestly am not a very visual reader. I really struggle to see things when I'm reading. Reading definitely has an appeal to me emotionally. I wouldn't necessarily say I like see it in my head, but I definitely visualized this whole story. I could just see everything that was happening, and it's not like super creepy. I don't read a lot of, you know, mystery thriller books, but it definitely was strange and unnerving. And again, kind of like the other books, this just opened my eyes to a different way of writing, which I feel like definitely stems from having a new experience as a reader. I feel like every time I experience something new, it then changes the way that I am as a writer. This was the first and only book to have ever slightly scared me, and one of the only books that I can vividly remember visualizing while I was reading it. And the last book that I want to talk about is actually a non-fiction book, and while it's not specifically about writing, it is about Burnout. This is by Emily and Amelia Nagoski, and this is all about dealing with day-to-day stresses and obviously burnout. This book does have a very strong feminist focus to it, and it does kind of specifically look at burnout in women, but absolutely this book can be applied to anyone, and I genuinely think it would be very beneficial for creators. I picked up this book because I was experiencing possibly the worst burnout ever. After doing my first semester of my creative writing masters, I ended up dropping out. I felt horrible, not only for dropping out, but also horribly burnt out. So I randomly picked this up. I saw this in a bookstore and just decided to buy it because I thought I could really use some insight into what I'm going through, and this definitely helped, and this definitely changed the way that I approach my writing and just simply as like being someone who is creative. It changed the way that I think about engaging with my own work. And I mean, it didn't like magically solve my burnout issues, it didn't magically make me ready to write again, but it did really help me deal with that. And I think in general this book is just written in such a like positive and uplifting way that it could just be a really nice little motivator, little pick-me-up if you're ever feeling a little bit stuck with your work or just in life in general. I had to mention this because I feel like as creators, burnout is something that you will run into at some point. As I mentioned at the start of this video, maybe you're starting to feel a little burnt out if you're participating in NaNoWriMo. I know I am. I probably will be coming back to this book sometime soon, and I think I'll probably come back to it multiple times throughout my life. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, so I don't really know how to rate it in comparison, but this book definitely gives you practical advice that you can take away and implement into your life, as well as providing just some very useful information. So this is the last book that I wanted to recommend, and while it might not be inspiring, I think that it is inspiring in the sense that it is helpful. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. But those are all of the books that I wanted to talk to you guys about. Obviously, I love all of these books for very different reasons, but ultimately at the end of the day, they are just some of my favorite books. As I said at the start of this video, I think I have a lot of favorite books. I'll probably do a like second part to this video, maybe just books that have influenced my life as a reader. I don't know, maybe I'll do something a little bit more specific. If you have any ideas, let me know. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys maybe got some inspiration, not even necessarily to pick up these books, but maybe just to go back and revisit some of your favorite inspiring books. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you guys with another video sometime soon. Bye!